weekly Bible study. This evening we're continuing our look at the book of Esther, and if you're joining us for the first time and you want to catch up after this evening, you can find all our Bible studies on our webpage, trinitymalpas.com, and look under the heading of Bible studies, and they're all there. That's if you'd like to catch up after tonight. Let's start with some prayer. Father, thank you that in spite of these difficult circumstances, we are still able to meet together via the medium of internet to study your word. I pray, Lord, that you would anoint me tonight now as I open your word. I pray that the words I speak will be your words, not mine. I ask that you open the eyes, hearts and minds of all who listen to this word, that they may receive what you want them to receive, that they may hear you speak to them individually. And I ask that you would send your Holy Spirit to be with us all now this evening. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, so we're going to start this evening in chapter 6. And while you're all finding that, I'll have a quick recap on last week. You remember last week, the Queen has finally put her request before the king. Haman has been unmasked and punished by the king. So we're going to pick it up this week at chapter 6, and we'll read the first 3 verses initially. That night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this, the king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. Okay, I guess the first thing I can say is those of you who have trouble sleeping, you can take comfort from the fact that you're in good company, royal company in fact, because the king couldn't sleep. Spurgeon puts it like this: Ahasuerus is master of 127 provinces, but could not master 10 minutes sleep. Now, in case you hadn't already made the connection, I want you to notice that the king's sleepless night occurred on the same night that Haman had determined that he was going to press for the execution of Mordecai the next day. The same morning that Haman was going to have Mordecai executed, the king chooses to bestow on Mordecai the highest honor in the land. And at the same time, Haman is humiliated greatly. And what I guess is even more amazing is that the king has no idea of the bitter blow that he has dealt Haman, and how humiliated he is feeling after this. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't believe in coincidences. I don't believe that the king just happened to have a sleepless night that night. I don't believe that he just happened to choose to have the Chronicles read to him that night, and that he just happened to discover the fact that Mordecai had foiled an assassination plot against him. I believe that this can be seen as part of God's plan. Part of God's plan to redeem the Jews, to save them from the fate that Haman is planning for them. Carefully planned, if you like. Perhaps God orchestrated the sleepless night. God put into the king's mind to have the Chronicles read. And it was certainly no accident that the part about Mordecai foiling the assassination plot was what was read out. It must have triggered something in the king's mind. He must have remembered the incident, and then suddenly thought, perhaps, did we reward him about that after? So he asks the people who are reading, and they say, no, nothing has been done to reward him. These records that the king brought out to read. There are several places in the book of Esther, if you read it, where proclamation translations are made throughout the Persian Empire, and it seems to have been standard procedure that they were issued to every people according to their language. But I wonder what language and script was used in the royal palace for the official records. I wonder what kind of records the scribes would have carried in. Would they have been leather or papyrus scrolls written in ink, or a pile of clay tablets impressed with cuneiform sign? Now, although records from the royal court, or in other words, the chronicles as they're called, have been found at many sites and from many time periods, none has yet been found from Susa, the palace where all this is taking place. However, 2 hoards of such documents were found at Persepolis, a palace complex which was largely built by Xerxes himself. The first was known as the Persepolis Fortification Tablets. It was an archive of at least 20,000 tablets that dated to the reign of Darius the Great, who, as you've heard before, was the father of King Xerxes. The second, known as the Persepolis Treasury Tablets, is a smaller group of about 140 that come from the reign of Darius the Great and Artaxerxes I. They record a variety of daily events, including things that happened, transactions that took place, payments made to associates of the king, and allotments given to various persons connected with the royal household. Now, the vast majority of these tablets found are written in the language known as Elamite. A small number are written in other languages, such as Greek, Aramaic, or Old Persian, but these are the exceptions. So before you run away with the idea that the king, having his sleepless night, was tucked up in bed with a good book, it seems quite clear then that Xerxes' scribes brought in a huge pile of clay tablets. Probably quite a lot of clay tablets actually, and read them to him in the Elamite language. And as I was reading this and studying through it, I couldn't help smiling, because it seems to me that's a case of if the king can't sleep, then nobody else is sleeping either. I used to be a bit like that when I was a boy. If I was awake, so was everybody else. But now then, this book, the Chronicles, that was read to the king, apparently, if you're interested, you can buy a copy of this very book on Amazon for £26. So if you want to have a look at what the king was having read to him that night, then head for Amazon's website and buy it. And if you have a sleepless night, then you can stand there and read the Chronicles of King Xerxes. Anyway, he's there, probably wandering around the palace, having this read to him. He hears that there'd been a plot against his life, and that Mordecai had in effect saved his life by bringing to the attention of the relevant people the plot by Bigthana and Teresh to assassinate him. Now then, perhaps when it was read, something did trigger in his mind, and he remembered it. But equally possible that this, when it was reported, was actually dealt with by the people in the court, and the king might never have got to find out about it. This could have been the first time he heard about this assassination attempt. And that's why he asked what was done to reward him. When he finds that nothing had been done to him, he determines to rectify it. Let's pick it up now and read verses 4 to 9. The king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had erected for him. His attendants answered, Haman is standing in the court. "Bring him in," the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honour?" Now Haman thought to himself, "Who is there that the king would rather honour than me?" So he answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honour, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honour, and lead him on a horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done to the man the king delights to honour.'" So the king is determined to rectify this oversight and to reward Mordecai for saving his life. Who's in the court, he asks. His courtiers tell him Haman is here. I can imagine the king thinking, brilliant, Haman, just the man. Send him in, says the king. The king has no idea at all that he is just about to trample all over Haman's plans. Yeah. As far as the king is concerned, he simply wants to ask a trusted friend his advice concerning how to reward Mordecai. Now then, I like to call coincidences God incidences. And the next one occurs when the king speaks to Haman. He could have told Haman all about what he had just heard and asked his advice on how to honour Mordecai. Instead, he just asks Haman what should be done for the man the king delights to honour. And on hearing that, Haman's huge ego rears its ugly head. And how often God allows fallen man to set his own trap. Yes. And here we see Haman falling into his own trap. Ultimately, he is going to be the cause of his own demise, his own ultimate humiliation. Haman, in his arrogance, automatically assumes the king is referring to him. So he dreams up this amazing scenario in which he imagines himself the centre of everyone's imagination and attention. He imagines himself to be the one on the horse, being ridden through the streets, robed with the king's robe and the king's crown, with people saying before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honour. You know, if you think of Haman, really he was a tragic man who can only believe that he's done well when he has heard applause. In his childish desire to be praised and honoured by all, he asked for things that really matter very little, except to puff one up with pride. And whilst it's good, and sometimes appropriate, to have applause here on earth, it's really tragic if that's the way you live your life. Instead, we should be seeking and be satisfied with the applause that comes from heaven. Anyway, having dreamed of himself on the receiving end of the king's delight, he answers the king, for the man whom the king delights to honour, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. And then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honour. Then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honour. Now I imagine at this point that Haman must have thought all his Christmases had come at once. He's been elevated to the position of second in command of the empire, and now, in his own mind, he imagines himself on the king's horse, dressed in the king's robe, being paraded through the city and being adored by everybody and receiving all that applause. But his bubble is about to burst. Let's read two more verses, verses 10 and 11. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honour. I can only imagine how this must have stung. Not only is he not on the receiving end of all that he is suggesting, but Mordecai, of all the people in the empire the king could have chosen to reward, Mordecai was the last person on earth that Haman would want to be leading through the city streets, applying such honour to. How that must have hurt. But the king orders him to go and get the robe. So instead of being on the receiving end of all this adulation, he simply becomes the king's trusted royal prince. And he's got no choice but to obey the king, because he knows very well what the consequences will be if he refuses. But it doesn't take much imagination to imagine the hurt that he must be feeling, and how humiliated he must be feeling. And the ultimate humiliation was that it was public. Everybody in the city would have seen it. But I guess humiliation is only really humiliation when it's made public. I've said this a few minutes ago, I'll say it again. I can see God's hand all over this. It's easy to say that with hindsight. But on the very day the queen is going to reveal what Haman is planning, Mordecai has the highest honour in the land bestowed on him and gains the king's favour. And God uses the very person who is threatening the survival of the Jews to do it. Only God could have arranged such things so favourably for his people. Okay, read verses 12 to 14. Afterwards, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisers and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. So afterwards, Mordecai has just been rewarded with the highest honour in the land. And typical of a man who's so humble as Mordecai, he just goes back to the king's gate again and does exactly what he was doing before. Haman, however, hurries to his house mourning and with his head covered. The way they describe Haman going back to his wife is indicative of mourning, with his head covered. It means that Haman is acting as if someone dear to him has died. And in a way you could say that's true, because his pride has just been dealt a death blow. But he goes back to his wife and his friends and his advisors and tells them what has happened. Fully, I would imagine, expecting sympathy and understanding. But instead of sympathizing, his wife especially, and probably his advisors, have sensed the writing on the wall. Now, a point here, the wise men, the advisors that Haman has got, were very likely to have been magicians or stargazers. They have already realized that Haman could not win this battle against the Jews. Mordecai was the friend of the king. Haman's wife even could see the future well enough. Haman would not prevail against Mordecai, but Mordecai would prevail against Haman in any encounter. That is probably not what Haman wanted to hear. On top of everything that's happened to him that morning, he would have been in a state. But before they could talk about it further, before he could come to any decisions, the eunuchs have arrived to rush into the banquet the queen has organised. This time, I would imagine it was very different from the day before. I wouldn't imagine he was quite as keen to go to this banquet as he was the day before. The second day of the banquet that Haman and the king had been invited to attend by the queen. Don't forget, we heard earlier on in the study, these banquets quite often went on and on and on. The king had one when he threw Vashti out of the palace that lasted 7 days, if you remember. So day 2 of this banquet was nothing unusual at all. And the people who were sent to bring Haman to the banquet were working for Esther, her chamberlains. Esther, nor the king, would still not been aware of the embarrassment that had befallen Haman. I guess you could say that like a lamb led to the slaughter, Haman was escorted back to the banquet. He must have been feeling pretty miserable by now, I would imagine. Okay, let's start chapter 7 and read the first 4 verses. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And as they were drinking wine on that second day, the king again asked Queen Esther, "What is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favour with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." So it's the second day of the banquet. The king and Haman have been invited. They've turned up and they're sat down ready. So, seeing as how these banquets are known to drag on, the king wouldn't have been too perturbed by the queen's request that they come back tomorrow and that she would reveal her request then. So they sit him at the table. Once again, the king asks the queen what her petition is, promising her once again anything up to half the kingdom. Then the queen made a request. We read in verse 3, the queen says, "If I have found favour with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request." You know, when Esther made that request, far from blurting it out, she showed a great deal of tact and wisdom in how she went about it. Because for a start, she has not immediately identified herself as a Jew, targeted for massacre. She didn't blurt out, "Haman is going to kill us all, please stop him." She appealed to the king on a personal basis. She knew that she'd never done anything but please the king. If you like, she played on the fact that she was the king's favourite. She goes on to tell the king then that she and her people have been sold for destruction, for slaughter, and for annihilation. And by saying this, Esther is actually recounting the exact language of Haman's decree: destruction, slaughter, and annihilation. And she goes on to say that if they had been sold simply as slaves, then she wouldn't have said anything. And by doing this, I believe that she is emphasizing once again the fact that she and her people are in grave danger, that they are going to be wiped out. Now, when you're reading this, if you by happen to hear a thump, that would probably have been the sound of Haman's jaw dropping as he learns for the first time that the queen herself belongs to the race of people he desires to annihilate. I wonder how he was feeling right at that moment, knowing that the king's favourite wife is one of the people that is likely to be killed by the edict that he has written and sealed with the king's signet ring. We'll never know for sure, but at this point it's not unreasonable to assume that she might even have shown the king a copy of the edict written by Haman, because don't forget this was plastered not only all over the provinces but all over the palace of Susa, so it wouldn't have been too difficult for her to get hold of one to show to the king. I wonder if by now Haman realizes what's in stake, what's in store for him. I wonder if he realizes now that this is all coming undone. It's all unraveling before him. What surprised me as well about this whole thing is the king's acceptance of the disclosure of Esther's ethnicity without comment. We don't read of him saying, "You, a Jew." We don't read of him saying anything. She'd never told him before, and he had never asked. So there's no reason why he should have known. And showing great tact in how she goes about it, first she asks him to spare her life. And then she asks for the life of her people. And that again is a clever ploy designed to appeal to the king's fondness of the queen. She could have blurted out, he's going to kill my people and I. Can you save my people and I? But first of all, she appeals to where she knows the king will respond. He is trying to kill me. Will you spare my life? And then she goes on to say, and the lives of my people. What a clever woman this person is. The king is outraged when he hears what's planned against the Jews and against Esther. Probably more against his wife than he is the Jews at this particular moment in time. His response to Esther's question, the adversary, who is he and where is he? Esther's response, the adversary, this wicked Haman. Now if Haman hadn't realised already by now that it's coming undone, no, he will be. He will be starting to flatly panic by now. The king is furious. But I would imagine that as well as being furious, he must have been flabbergasted. It must have been a shock to the king, not only to learn that anyone could threaten the life of his queen, but it was the man whom he had trusted to be his number two that was going to do it. I would imagine he had been shocked that he had trusted Haman so much and he had turned out to be so evil, planning even to kill his own wife, the queen. By doing this, Haman has in effect thrown the king's friendship back in his face. And the king is furious. Verse 6 tells us of Haman's reaction to this disclosure as well by the queen. We're told he was terrified. And quite frankly, I don't blame him, because he would have known Persian law well enough to know what was in store for him by now. And don't forget, Haman's own wife had said to him that day, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall is started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. And I would imagine those words were ringing in Haman's head as he heard the queen accuse him. And now, the final nail, he's found out the queen is Jewish as well. I can't even imagine how he's feeling right at this moment. I would imagine terrified is probably the biggest understatement in the Bible. What a change of fortunes for one man. What a fall from grace. It was only yesterday that Haman believed there was no one in the kingdom that the king would desire to honour more than himself. Now, there was no one within the kingdom that stood to face such great wrath as was coming from the king. Yesterday, Haman had the world at his feet. Today, death is calling him by name. Incidentally, just going off subject a little bit, do you remember earlier on in the study we talked about a governor by the name of Tattenai who ruled in the area where Jerusalem was and who tried to stop the rebuilding of the Jerusalem and the temple. Well, I don't know how many of you realise it, but Haman's wife Zeresh was actually his daughter. So there's a connection as well. It's funny how you read these books, not only Esther, but also Nehemiah and Ezra, and the whole thing is interconnected. Yeah. All the major players are all connected with each other somehow. It's quite astonishing. So seeing as how she grew up, probably in a home not far from Jerusalem, that is probably how she knew so much about the Jews. That is probably where she learned that God protects the Jews. Yeah. And that is why when she found out that Mordecai was a Jew and that Haman was going to take him head on, she knew that Haman was taking on the God of Israel and was not going to win. And while we're having a quick look at people, let's have a look at Haman as a man. Just a quick look. Some leaders have got a strong character. They're ruthless and evil. And people fear these men because of who they are. because of what they're capable of doing, because of what they know that that person will do if you upset him. Haman was not one of these. He was a man with a weak character. People feared his position in the kingdom and the authority it carried rather than the man himself. He seems to have had a huge problem with what we would call today rejection. He needed people to be constantly praising and honouring him. If they didn't, rather than killing them on the spot, which is what a stronger man would probably have done, he goes home and cries on the shoulder of his wife and friends, taking their counsel as to what to do, not the actions of a strong man or a strong leader. And now we see him terrified before the queen and the king. Whereas I would imagine a man, a leader of stronger character, would have probably set his jaw and said, "Come on, do your worst." That's not Haman, he's terrified. And the king, furious, angry, leaves the table and goes into the garden. Matthew Henry puts it like this: the king retires in anger. He rose from the table in a great passion and went into the palace garden to cool himself and to consider what was to be done. He sent not for his 7 wise counsellors who knew the times, being ashamed to consult them about the undoing of that which he had rashly done without their knowledge or advice. But he went to walk in the garden a while to compare his thoughts, what Esther had now informed him, with what had formerly passed between him and Haman. And we may suppose him, firstly vexed at himself, that he should be such a fool as to doom a guiltless nation to destruction, and his own queen among the rest, upon the base suggestions of a self-seeking man, without examining the truth of his allegations. Those that do things with self-will reflect upon them afterwards with self-reproach. Secondly, vexed at Haman, whom he had laid in his bosom, that he should be such a villain as to abuse his interest in him, to draw him to consent to so wicked a measure. When he saw himself betrayed by one he had caressed, he was full of indignation at him. Yet he would say nothing till he had taken time for second thoughts, to see whether they would make the matter better or worse than it first appeared, and that he might proceed accordingly. Haman by now has seen the writing on the wall. He knows what's coming. He knows the king well enough to know better than to try and reason with the king when he's angry, especially when he was the cause of that anger. And another thing, incidentally, when the king of Persia orders an offender to be executed and then rises and goes off into the women's apartments, it's a sign that no mercy is to be hoped for. Even the sudden rising of the king in anger was the same as if he had pronounced a death sentence. So by now Haman knows what is coming. He stays behind and tries to reason with the queen, to beg for his life at the queen's presence. Let's read 2 more verses, verses 8 to 10. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on a couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. He had it made for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." The king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. And then the king's fury subsided. So the king's been out in the garden, composing his thoughts, cooling himself down. Perhaps he's succeeded. Perhaps he's cooled himself down a bit and he's gone back into the banquet hall, determined on a course of action. He walks in just in time to see Haman lying on the couch where the queen was reclining. Now, the truth is, I'm sure we've all seen the old movies where the man decides upon the course of action and the woman throws herself at his feet and grabs his ankles and pleads with him not to do it. I imagine this is what was happening here. Haman had thrown himself at the queen for her mercy, the equivalent of grabbing her feet and saying, "Please, please spare my life." But the king didn't see it like that. And if he walked in from the garden having calmed himself down, then this is guaranteed to have lit the fuse again. Listen to Matthew Henry again. We do not know the precise form of the couches on which the Persians reclined at the table, but it is probable that they were not very different from those used by the Greeks and the Romans. Haman, perhaps at first, stood up to beg the pardon of Esther, but driven in his extremity to resort to an attitude of the most earnest supplication, he fell prostrate on the couch where the queen was recumbent. The king, returning in that instant, was fired at what seemed an outrage on female modesty. As the king walked through that door, his anger would have flared again. Any hope that Haman had ever had of mercy disappeared the moment the king walked in and saw him on the couch like that. The king said, he made his feelings clear with what he said. Will he even molest the queen when she's in the house with me? As soon as the words about molesting the queen had left the king's mouth, his attendants who were with the king, they jumped on Haman and covered his face. Now, the implication of this action, covering his face, is that a criminal is unworthy to look any longer at the face of the king. Now, although it's known that Alexander the Great used this technique, and secular historians tell us that the Romans were fond of using this technique as well, beyond this one mention in the book of Esther, there is no other evidence, biblical or secular, for the fact that this was standard practice in the Persian Empire, to cover a criminal's face. But if you look at the Hebrew word which has been translated, they covered, with a slight change, it could be translated as his face became flushed. And so we could see that they grabbed him, and rather than covering his face, as the word suggests, Haman's face simply became flushed and red with shame and embarrassment. But whichever way it went down, Haman is doomed. Another thing that struck me as I was reading this and planning it was the swift reaction of the courtiers. Now, they're always on hand to do the king's bidding. They're always around. They would have been waiting on the table as the banquet was going on. They would have been in the vicinity. Had they witnessed this exchange between the queen and the king standing off, and Haman throwing himself at the queen's feet? Or had the king grabbed them on the way back in from the garden and had a word with them before going back into the banquet? And another thing that struck me was the fact that it was one of the men who went to fetch Haman to the banquet in the first place who pointed out to the king that the gallows had been built by Haman's house. Now, this all tells me that perhaps Haman might not have been as well liked in the court as he thought he was. That everybody in the court hated him, but just tolerated him for the king's sake. And I wonder whether or not they've simply taken this opportunity to get rid of Haman. What a golden opportunity to get rid of the man they hate. They've jumped on him before the king can change his mind. They've pointed out the fact that this gallows already built before the king can change his mind. And the king responds, hang him on them. And so, we see Haman taken out and hanged on the very structure that he planned to hang Mordecai on. What an irony that Haman, the man who planned a mass murder of the Jews, should end up being the victim of his own form of execution. But once the king has given this order, hang Haman on the gallows, we're told his fury subsides. And incidentally, if you want to look further into this business about the gallows, I talked about it last time. I'm not going to talk about it again because it's pretty gruesome, but Google it, Persian Empire gallows, and you'll see for yourself what exactly they did to Haman, and it wasn't pleasant. And I think we'll call it a day there. Thank you very much.